I'm Lucy.
And I'm Jennifer.
You're listening to Everything I Know About.
Each week, we share everything we know about a new topic, equipped with some internet research and a little too much exposure to pop culture.
Hi, everybody. Lucy here. Jennifer is not with us today, and we're actually doing a little bit of a different format for today's episode since I have a very special guest with me. I'm here in Brooklyn in my apartment on the couch, and I have a guest with me in person. So I've got Cherish with me.
Hi, everyone.
Cherish is a friend of a friend. Well, now we've become friends, but even when I first met her, I had some context on you already. I had heard some gossip from our mutual friend who's like, oh, you're going to meet my friend Cherish. She's super interesting. She was born into a cult. And so before I even met you, I was like, wow, have literally never heard anyone being introduced that way in my life. I don't know a lot of people who've been in cults. And even when we started this podcast over a year ago and we were thinking, Jennifer and I were like, are we ever going to have guests? Like, what's the format of our show? I was like, probably it's going to be us, but we will make the rare exception. Like if someone has a spectacular story to tell or like a super unique perspective, of course, we would love to have that. And that's what we're doing today. So Cherish is here. Our episode today is going to be specifically on the Children of God cult and Cherish's experience. I'm going to let her introduce herself. And I'm super interested to hear more about her life, even though we've now hung out a few times. I've never really dug into her past in this way. So you guys will be learning along with me. And yeah, I'm super excited to have you here.
Thank you for having me. I don't know. I have these delusions in my head where there's so many cults out there. Lots of people have been in cults, but then at the same time, it's like, well, I didn't know I was in a cult until I was much older. But yeah, no, it's great to be here. And yeah, I feel like we've not really had a chance to hang out more and talk about my background. So it's really fun to be able to do that. So yeah, so just, I guess for context, I'm back in New York now. My family's in Atlanta, and Atlanta's where we landed when we left back in 99 or whatever it was. But I've spent so much time now just thinking about my childhood and what that was like. And I've come to a lot of conversations with my parents and just have a lot to say on the topic. So it's good to start talking about this now.
And thank you so much for everything you're about to share. Really appreciate you being open and willing to have this conversation, not only with me, but everybody listening. I guess the context for me for when I've heard these types of stories has always been watching a Netflix documentary. And there's always some part of that I'm like, that has to be sensationalized. They're telling a narrative in a way that's supposed to make it very entertaining. And everyone who's listening knows I'm a big true crime fan, which is slightly different, but I think people are fascinated with cult stories. And I think it shares that kind of voyeuristic, uncomfortable feeling when you are a member of the audience and you're like, okay, I like this, but should I be thinking critically about why? And is it concerning that I'm prying into these folks' lives and whatnot? And I say that all as a person who has watched many of these cult documentaries. I'm literally reading right now the book Dinner for Vampires. Have you heard of this? Okay, so Bethany Joy Lenz, who is a member of the One Tree Hill cast, she realized she was in a cult. It also took her some time. I'm not through the book yet, but that's been super interesting because I'm listening to the audiobook and she narrates it, which I think is so powerful to I guess in that experience, it's not mediated through a director or a documentarian, whereas my other experiences with this have been watching shows.
I think it's important to let people have the time to process and share on their terms, which is where I'm at today, right? That's why I can be here doing this. There's something we're so drawn to with cults because I think there's something so unimaginable about being caught up in something like that. And the conditions under which you're operating are so different from the day-to-day or from most people's average life. And so there's just this sort of how and why and how does somebody end up there and how do they leave that too? One of the things I know deeply is that nobody joins a cult. You join a movement or an organization or a group of people, and only much later do you find yourself under conditions that you realize are not normal. And I think that was very much true with my family. The Children of God came out of the 1970s. In the 1970s, there were a lot of people who were disillusioned with what was happening in the States and the political climate and the Vietnam War. And a lot of these kinds of hippie cults kind of came out of that era. And the Children of God was one of them in California by a man named David Berg. And there's so much to the history there. So it was really my grandparents who joined a church at the time. They were believers and they were disillusioned with what was happening in the States, and they wanted community. They wanted a place to raise children and go back to the values that they had. And fast forward 3 generations later, the group is disbanded, and my generation, the third generation, is dealing with the consequences.
I wasn't familiar with the Children of God before I had met you, but it's huge. I feel like you hear about the Manson, or like Jim Jones, right? But the sheer size of Children of God is insane. And for it to have lasted so long and only be disbanded very recently in history is shocking to me. Hey, this is Lucy from the editing room, jumping in here to add some very high-level context about the Children of God. We chose not to focus on these facts during the conversation because they're so staggering that they kind of risk overshadowing everything else. And we really wanted to focus on Cherish's personal experience leaving that world, making her way in the States, and her reflections. Okay, so here are some facts. The Children of God was a religious cult founded in 1968 by David Berg. It began as a Christian movement inspired by hippie counterculture, promising a better way of life outside the, quote, system. Members gave up their possessions, lived in communes, and became full-time missionaries. Through aggressive proselytizing, the group rapidly expanded to 10,000 members across 170 countries and maintained that size for decades. However, behind this front of humanitarian aid, the group became increasingly abusive. David Berg and his leadership introduced more and more radical, insidious beliefs and practices. Members of the group were isolated from the outside world and provided a steady drip of propaganda. They were told they were end-time soldiers for the apocalypse and were expected to give up their lives and autonomy. They were pressured to use sex as a way of gaining followers and money for the group. They were encouraged to practice free love, a dangerous euphemism that often meant sex without consent and sex before the age of consent. Abuse, including of minors, was rampant. By the 80s and 90s, the group faced investigations for kidnapping, child abuse, and prostitution. Thousands eventually escaped. The group officially disbanded its communes in 2010. Okay, I'm going to drop us back into the episode. As Cherish mentioned, her grandparents joined the Children of God early in its formation. Her parents were then born into the cult, and so is she. At this point, when it relates to your life and your family, like your parents are alive at this point, and they're young, and they've only ever known this life. You were a baby, and I'm curious about your mom in particular. Like, what was she thinking?
Yeah, it's crazy to think about my parents at that time. I was born in 91, and my parents were so young. My mom was married when she was 14, and she had me just a couple of years later. But this had been her whole life, both of them. This has been their whole life. And I think when the investigations started, and actually one of the communes I was at was under investigation, but it was so hard to reconcile everything that they knew and all of the teachings that they had had. And they had explicitly been told, people will persecute us, which is such a common and effective way to keep people from talking. So she's 16, 17. She's believing that we're being persecuted. It's hard for her to understand maybe even what's happening, though, truly. I think that one of the things I've always thought about my parents is like, I'm incredibly impressed that even though they didn't have access to information that would tell them the things that were happening were wrong, they knew deep down inside. A part of them knew. I think that's really impressive, considering the amount of indoctrination that was present. And she was a child, essentially.
Her motivation for leaving was really her kids, right? Or, I mean, I'm sure it's so much more complicated. I guess maybe that's like the shorthand, but tell us about that journey.
I think it is complicated. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about their decision to leave and how they left. And it's actually not something I've talked to them very much about. It's crazy that, 20 years later, some parts of the story are still hard to talk about with them. But we're all very close. And, when we came to the States, we had to figure out a way to leave and make it in the world altogether. So that was a very important bonding experience for all of us. But reflecting on their decision to leave, it was really hard for them. I don't know that they knew exactly why they needed to get out. I know that they talk about how the teachings and the expectations had just gotten to be too much. There was just so much that was expected of them, including, 100% tithe. They had to give all of their money up all the time. And it started to feel impossible to keep up with the demands and the expectations. And it also started to feel trapped, right? If anything happened, what could we do? We have no education, we have no money, there's no way out. And growing up abroad, you find yourself in these situations of instability, even just in certain countries. And I think it started to, once they had 4 kids, and it was a matter of like, well, we could take care of ourselves, but what are we going to do for these kids? Like, they're young. If anything were to happen, are we capable of doing anything in this? And they realized no, actually. And it was a combination of, this group is now asking too much, and I can't meet those demands, and I should protect these kids. People had also started leaving, and there was now precedent for getting out. And I think that's an important fact too.
Yeah, I can't even imagine like the fear. You're raised in this environment, you don't know anything else. You're told everyone's out to get you, everyone's a bad person, only here are the good people. But then inside something's not quite right. But how do you know you can trust yourself? I don't know. After people leave, like they don't have contact with the people inside. So it's not like they can. Have you seen the show Silo?
Yeah.
That's literally what I'm thinking about right now. For our listeners, if you haven't seen it, it's like a sci-fi show. It's great, but the outside world they're told it'll kill you. And you as the viewer and the people in the show, like you don't know what's real because you see people go outside and they seem to die, but you don't know why. You don't know what's causing it. And I also recently read the book for Pagebound Spring Read Along. We read I Who Have Never Known Men. Yeah, you're nodding. Highly recommend. Super fascinating as well. Since I've never been in this situation, I feel like I read because it obviously helps one develop empathy. And so I think my brain is automatically going into these situations where I'm like, wow, to even watch or read about someone going through that experience. I just don't know where the strength comes from. I think it takes so much internal strength to go against everything that you've ever known. And yeah, I mean, kudos to them.
I think it's very fear-based. And I think it's less about where my parents were going towards, but what they were going away from. And it was where the fear of life out in the real world and making something of that was less than the fear of what would happen if they stayed in. And it's so sad because you're just in this kind of survival mode and you're just driven by which option is worse here. And they decided that staying was worse. But it's not to say that they thought going out was good. It was just less worse.
I mean, that's so sad, honestly, that it was that bad. Because you would think that it would be, I feel like it's often portrayed as this really brave decision, but actually they just had no other choice.
And I think going back a little bit to kind of like what helped them leave, there were a couple things that, as I said, having seen people who had left before and realizing they were not struck dead, in fact, they were out in the world doing something with their lives. Also, because this was a group that was born out of the States, we had kind of held on to this American dream idea in the group. And a lot of folks in the group recognized the power of an American passport, and people were encouraged to like marry Americans, and having American citizenship was really helpful abroad. And so it's interesting that despite all of the teachings, there was this constant belief that there was something good about the States, America, which is like also a very common immigrant narrative. And that really existed in our group. And my parents believed it. And every time they could kind of like sneak some contraband or they could get out and watch a movie, they were really always captured by what was happening in the States and what life could be like there. So that was, I think, also something that maybe helped them believe it was possible.
Tell us about how they got out, that whole process. Honestly, I'm just curious about the logistics. Like, if you have no money, like, how do you even know where to go or how to function? And then also that first year after they got out and the adaptation, not only for them, but also for you. And I mean, you were young, so I feel like kids are able to do it more easily, but definitely harder for older folks.
Yeah, the logistics were challenging. I think that once they became a little more and more disillusioned with the teachings and they started to have their doubts, they started doing things to be a little bit more self-protective. So if they came back with some money, rather than give all of it up, they would keep a little bit for themselves and they would hide it. And so after months of hiding some cash, when they were ready to leave, I think they took some more money from somewhere in the house and we just left with maybe one luggage between us. Got to the airport, got a one-way ticket, went to the States. My grandmother had already left. And so we had a landing place with her. She was in Atlanta. We flew to Atlanta and stayed with her. And I think it's so impossible to leave a place like that unless you have someone to receive you on the other side. So thank God for my grandmother who had already gotten out and was able to help us land in Atlanta. And yeah, that first year of you're starting over with nothing. Not only are you starting over with nothing, just materially, you don't even have knowledge. And I remember my mom telling me years later, like, yeah, I didn't know how to put gas in a car. I had never walked in a bank before. I didn't know what a check was. I didn't know anything about the school system. I had to enroll you guys in school and I had no idea what that was. And we also had no papers. And so we were like, yeah, of course they've been homeschooled. That's totally what we were doing. But my parents knew that there were no other options. And so they were just incredibly hardworking and focused on surviving. They were willing to learn everything and anything they needed to as fast as possible and tap into a group of ex members who I think also helped them navigate the real world now.
I'm curious if there was one moment that your parents ever told you about that was like their aha moment. This is a tough question. I'll give you an example. Like my parents are immigrants. I'm Chinese American. My dad always tells this story about when he first came to America because my mom was still in China. China was communist at the time and it was hard to leave. My dad was able to leave because he got a position at Wayne State in Michigan. My mom wasn't allowed to quit her job. Like you couldn't just quit your job. And so she was still trying to get her way out. And fortunately, they were already married in China. So that helped her eventually be able to come. But when my dad first came to America, growing up, he would say, I got this 2-for-1 ad at Burger King. And I went to Burger King and I had a burger. And he was like, that's when I knew. It was like this moment of like, oh, I'm like in America, this place that, you know, what you were saying about how there was still this idea of like America being on a pedestal, even in your family context. That was true for my family context very much as well. Like America was a place of abundance. And I think my dad, there's this very, very small moment for him was like, it sunk in kind of that he was, he like flown across the world, was in this place he knew nothing about, didn't speak the language very well. So I'm just curious if there was anything like that for your parents where when you were growing up, they would be like, it just kind of hit. Cause like, I think your body is in fight or flight, like what you were describing. You're just like surviving, you're doing everything you need to leave, to fly to Atlanta, to put down roots. And if there was just like something where it just sunk in.
I think there were little moments along the way, like maybe our first parent teacher conference and my mom realizing like my kids are in school, they're in the education system. And that kind of hit her in the moment. Or getting our first car and having that be ours. Really anything that we were able to like acquire and have be ours and ours alone was always a little win kind of along the way. I think though, at the deepest level, I don't think it sunk in until many, many years later. And maybe it's because there were 4 of us kids and getting all of the kids through the education system and also navigating your own career and trying to figure out how you're going to make a living sustainably in the United States. Like there was always that. But I think maybe like the first vacation we took as a family, where it was just like, there is even just enough mental and financial space. I don't even remember where we went. Like 2 hours over to the next city. It doesn't matter. It was some small little family vacation, but just the idea that like we could all get in a car, we could afford to go rent some hotel rooms somewhere else and just spend some time together doing nothing, just spending time together. And I remember vacations feeling so like such a luxury for us and so unimaginable at earlier points in time, just incomprehensible. And then there was us on the beach.
I'm curious about your experience. So you were how old when they left?
I was 8 or 9, I think.
So you have memories of being in both worlds. Do you remember like when you first went to school and what was that like?
It was so bizarre. It was the strangest thing. And I remember one of my most vivid memories from that first year I was in school was watching everyone stand up and do the Pledge of Allegiance. And I was like, what is happening? I don't understand. Am I in another cult? Everyone knew what to say.
Yeah, I was like, I can imagine that you were probably like, oh, fuck.
I was so thrown. I was like, they have this memorized. The only things I have memorized, I don't know. I don't know about this, guys. It was tough the first year that we were in the States. It's interesting too, though, because like I'm eight or nine, I forget. I'm about to go to school for the first time. It was all very confusing, but I'm not thinking we're coming from a cult. Like I didn't realize I had grown up in a cult until years later. And so in my mind, I'm just like, well, I grew up abroad. I'm just moving to a new country and it's weird that we have our own house and that, we're not in a commune anymore, but I've had to adapt to situations before. I didn't really understand what was happening. My parents, though, I was old enough to see them going through this and I could see the fear and I could see the survival drive. And even my mom telling me, like, we have to make this work. Like, you have to do good in school because, like, everything's riding on us being able to make something of ourselves in the States. So I understood all of that and was very motivated to work as hard as my parents were working, but I didn't understand the context that we were now in and where we had come from.
Did the other kids accept you?
They did. And I think that a couple things that helped is I'm white, light skinned, light hair, light eyes. I looked like them. I also grew up speaking English. I didn't show up with an accent, even though I was raised completely abroad. And so my English and my looks allowed me to blend in. And I myself understood the importance of blending in. So I was quite quiet, just observing for as long as I could, just to kind of learn what normal behavior was. And I remember consciously trying to catalog what was appropriate behavior in this new world so that I could mimic it. What's the radio? Let me go listen to the radio for the first time. Or what's TV? Like, let's watch the show we never had access to TV before. So let me just start. I was very focused on learning as much as I could about this new culture and about these people and how they operated so that I could look like them, be like them, act like them. And I did. It was a matter of survival. I had to. The other thing was that nobody knew where I had come from. And at home, we had been told not to talk about it. Just pretend like we've been here forever. Great. Okay. So there was no way for anybody to know that I had come from anywhere different. I didn't need to talk about it and I was afraid to talk about it. And so for many years, I just didn't.
Okay, so at 8 or 9, like you have an identity. Like you're old enough where you have a personality, you have an identity. Now you're in a position where you're acting all the time. Was that like super confusing? Did you know this is who I am and then this is who I'm becoming? Or you were just like, I'm just surviving and I'm doing whatever I have to do to survive?
Very much in survival mode. And I think even before that, in the Children of God, I played a role. My role was missionary. My role was witnessing. I had a role to play. There were expectations. I don't think I came to the States with an identity, and I don't think I was afforded any time to develop it in the States for a while. And so that journey of understanding who I was and having a chance to think about my identity didn't come till years later, which maybe for other people that happens. You grow up in kind of a tumultuous environment or a chaotic environment where you're not given the space or the support to form a sense of self. You're not going to be able to until you're outside of that environment and in a safe space with the mental bandwidth to even do it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm thinking like about what I've seen depicted about foster kids and like especially as a child, like you have no control. Like adults decide the world around you. And I feel like a lot of foster kids, it's one of two paths. They either become quiet and withdrawn and they keep it all in, or they really act out and they rebel and they go through that like really intense teenage rebellion phase. Like, did you go through that? And like when you finally had the time where you were like, you were surviving and you kind of maybe were more aware that you had this cult experience, were you just angry? What were you feeling?
I think the safest emotion that came out first was anger and rage. And I remember I think I learned really what the cult was on my own. I did some Googling when I was like 12 or 13. And I confronted my parents about it. And I was like, where did we come from? Because what I'm reading says some crazy things. And they're like, it's true. For a long time, I was very angry, not even with my parents. I was angry with my grandparents. I was like, how did we end up here? I I don't understand. And I didn't have anyone to talk me through it or help me process it. And so it was just a lot of rage and anger that I think was the safest emotion to come out at the time that lasted for years. The anger felt really powerful and it didn't transform into grief, I think, until many years later. And it had to kind of burn out a bit before I was able to really sit into the harder feelings with what had happened.
And when did you become comfortable talking about it with other people? I imagine you went through this. This was internal, like still nobody outside of the family knew. Now, I mean, clearly you're very comfortable. So, like, what was that journey like for you? How did you come to terms with it? I mean, just to say, like, Cherish didn't include this in her intro, but like, Cherish is incredibly impressive. The mutual friend, he went to Harvard Business School, and that's also where Cherish went. And she lives an incredibly successful life here in New York City and has incredibly close relationships, friends, all of that. And so you seem very, very, very well adjusted, having come from this wild background. So your whole family, I'm like, wow, you guys are like superhuman here.
I know I've told friends before that my greatest revenge is living a good life now, which feels so good. It feels so good to be here. Yeah, growing up, we were always told not to talk about it. I learned that we came from a cult when I was 12 or 13, and then it was very much absolutely do not talk about this. But I learned as I got older and older, I realized that my parents' generation had a different experience in the cult than I did. I was still quite young when we left, and it was easier for me to talk about it. My parents' generation were more fully ingrained in the cult, and so their fear of talking about it was deeper than mine. And even though they had instructed me not to talk about it, I believed it. I thought that the horrible, horrible things would happen if I ever told anyone. I realized as I got older and older that those were not true, that those were kind of teachings, right? This fear of if you let the outside world know, then bad things will happen. And also that I wasn't as close to the experience that it was going to be traumatic for me to talk about it with my friends or with the people I trusted. I'm very sympathetic with why my parents didn't feel like they were at a place where they could discuss it with people and process it maybe externally. But I had a different experience, and I understood then that, oh, well, as a third generation, maybe my experience is such that I could process this externally with someone. And maybe that's what I need. And so I tried it out. I talked to a very close friend, and the response was so compassionate and so kind, and really slowly sharing more and more with people I trusted kind of reinforced that idea that it was going to be okay to talk about this. And it was actually helpful. And people were so understanding. And all those things I had been told about how no one would understand was not true.
When you go through something like traumatic, which obviously you did, you say people were really understanding. And I believe that. Like, I'm here sitting here trying to be understanding, but it's like, I guess it's different for someone to really understand versus like, say the nice things as I'm doing here. But was that ever like difficult for you, like a disconnect? Were you ever like, how can I really like meet someone who really, really understands me?
Absolutely. And I think in my teens and early 20s, my deepest desire was for someone to fully understand what I had been through. It felt so important to me. And every time I reached out for that, inevitably, the people who I loved, they got it, but they could never fully understand my experience. And I remember being really devastated by that for a long time, many years. I kept searching and searching. I'm like, but surely there's someone out there who gets it. Maybe I need to find another ex member, or maybe there's just, and it really was this desire to be seen and a desire to be understood. But because it's such a unique experience, there's just not going to be anyone who's been through that. No one will have lived your life. It's impossible. And once I understood two things, that it's impossible for anyone to have had my full experiences in parallel, and that really what this is rooted in is in a desire to be seen and heard, then I was able to slowly let go of the idea that I needed someone to understand me. And instead, I pulled that back a little bit too. I need someone to hear me, to see me, to be compassionate and kind with me, and to sit with me as I think about the things that I've been through. But for many years, it was hard. And I think that a lot of people experience that desire to be understood. I wonder now if anyone can ever be fully understood. And I think the answer is no. And I think that's totally fine. I think there are different ways to be present with each other that don't require you to have exactly the same experiences, because emotions and the feelings that we have about the things we've experienced transcend the experience themselves. And so it's really about understanding how we feel and seeing someone there over what they went through.
Yeah, that feels very wise. But I think that resonates. I feel that in my life I haven't gone through much struggle. Like I've been fortunate in many ways and I've had friends who've really I have a friend whose mother passed away from cancer when he was in his early 20s and I think I've always really struggled in situations like that because I don't know how to be there for someone when I feel like I cannot understand. I mean, how can I understand that level of pain? And, even for this interview, I was like, this is going to be such an interesting experience for me. Like, I don't feel like I can really understand what Cherish is going to share and like everything she's gone through. But it's funny because even as we're sitting here talking, I'm like, I mean, I can't, right? But what you're saying about the similar emotional resonance, like there are things that you're speaking, and I'm like, oh, like as a child of immigrants, there's a small piece of your experience that I've also experienced. And I think, although I cannot imagine exactly what you went through, like that feeling of needing to blend in to survive, of knowing you're different, but knowing how important it is, to fit in, the fears that come with that. Like there's so many things in my life where I'm like, yeah, I'm like surprising myself because I'm like, wow, humans, okay, give humans a shot. Like we can be empathetic. It's real.
That also helps in talking about this, because I think there was a time when I talked about the cult because I wanted people to understand what I had been through. And now it's not about that anymore. It's less about the cult and it's more about the personal journey I've been on. Like growing up with very young parents is an experience. And even if they're not physically young, growing up with emotionally immature parents is its own experience. Growing up between cultures, right? My home culture was something totally different from what I saw outside, both in the cult and once we got to the States. Blending in to survive, moving up the socioeconomic ladder, being able to put your needs aside to prioritize what your family needs or what your siblings need or what your parents need. Those are common situations people find themselves in, kind of outside of the details of how they ended up there. And people can connect over those shared feelings and challenges, no matter where they came from.
Now that you've done all this reflection, when you see the media I was referencing at the beginning of this episode, when I was like, I mean, I feel like every week there's a new cult documentary out there. There's a lot more people now who, similar to you, realize something about their childhood or the situation they were in maybe was not as it originally appeared. And they're writing books, they're talking about this more. Like, what are your thoughts on that as a whole? I'm sure you've consumed a lot of that media. I know you even brought a book about the children of God called, for folks who are watching on video, I'm holding up the book, but it's called Sex Cult Nun by Faith Jones. I mean, someone is talking about not your specific experience, but you have your own perspective on like what is it like being in this world where everyone is obsessed? I'm gonna, use that generally. Everyone, me clearly, is obsessed with cults. And like, do you feel like you have a role to play there? Are you critical of the media that you see, or do you think there's like pros and cons with it?
I'm sympathetic to the obsession that people have with cults. There's something in human nature that is drawn to the aberrant and the different. And a cult is so different. I also feel that survivors of cults deserve a chance to tell their story. And I don't know, even just, I don't know how to phrase this exactly, but to be able to make money off of your memoir, good for you. Good for you. Like, you went through this harrowing experience, you write about it, it becomes successful. I want that success for you. I think it can also be a way for people to process their traumas. It can be a way for them to profit off of their traumas in a way that I respect for certain folks. But I do think some things get lost in this kind of like voyeuristic curiosity with cult experiences. And I think that the best way to use the media and all the content out there on cults is to use this as a starting point to reflect on yourself, your relationship with your community, your relationship with people. Like, I think it's very easy for people to get caught up in the details and the facts of what happened and just kind of like, oh, wow, but what about this or what about that? and forget that like there's something underneath all of that, or maybe over all of that, which is like how people behave and the kinds of situations that anybody can find themselves in, and the kind of opportunity for self-reflection of like, what would I do? What's my moral code? And how would I know that that's going to be kept in check regardless of what circumstance I'm in? I think there's just like so much reflection that can be had with, sure, the facts of the cult are interesting, but that's just level one. And I wish more people engaged with the content on a deeper level as a means for like self-reflection versus just ingesting all of the gritty details and getting a thrill from that.
Yeah, I mean, that makes me think of this book I read again, like I Who Have Never Known Men by Jacqueline Hartman. It's interesting. She wrote the book in the 90s, and the premise is that there's 40 women who are kept in an underground bunker, and they don't know why they're there, and you don't know why they're there. And I think what's interesting about it is there are no details. There's no gritty details. There's no like, and they were forced to perform sex acts, or there was these heinous crimes. No, like there's none of that. It's told from the perspective of this she's the youngest of the 40 women. She has no memories prior to being in the bunker, whereas the older women do have memories of some before life. But she is just purely formed of this. And she knows that. She knows she's different from the other women. She's the narrator. And I found myself thinking so much about what I would do if I was in that situation. And if I just woke up one day and didn't have any memories and was in a cage and that was my reality, like how would I cope? How would I react? I was like, wow, like this is crazy. This is a short book. And I was like thinking so much about what I would do in that situation. And as you're saying this, I'm like, I wonder if part of the effectiveness of that book is because it so lacks detail. So that actually all you are working with is the real meat of the experience and the humanity of it rather than the distraction, which I think is like what a lot of those documentaries focus on, of the shock factor, the grisly whatnot that yes, people want to know, and all of the internet sleuths out there like want to dig up all of this because we like to look at the gristle. But like it really resonates with me what you're saying, that it can actually, even if you've never been through that experience, like I feel like I learned a lot from reading that book just about like the things that I admired in this narrator. And I was like, could I live up to that if that was me?
I love that. I love having that experience with that book. I don't fault anyone for wanting the gritty details, but that's not the most fulfilling and rewarding way to engage with this type of content. And that's also why I talk about it, because I think being able to see somebody actually and know a person and see them as part of a community and know that they have friends and family and that they have a career and that they're a whole person, and learning about their experience emotionally and connecting with them on that is so much more fulfilling and rewarding than just consuming the details. And I think anybody could find that level 2 or beyond of engagement. And there's a lot to learn about the self, about each other from engaging with it that way. I don't know.
Yeah, it's funny. So many of our episodes end on this kind of note. Again, totally not planned, but yeah, it's funny. Like I feel like we've been on a little journey because I, on purpose, did not try to do that much research ahead of this talk and look up the grisly details because I wanted to just see where this went. And honestly, this was like, I thought this was great. Like it surprised me in the best way, in that like really I think this conversation ended in a place where we're just talking as two humans rather than one human who is interested in learning about another human's cult experience, which is like was the start of this hour. So thank you to everybody who is listening. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. Thank you so much, Cherish, for being here with me, for taking a chance, doing your first podcast interview. I know it's like a very strange experience to talk into a microphone as if you had an audience, but really it's just me here. And yeah, we so appreciate your time. And for all our listeners, we will be back in 2 weeks and Jennifer will be here for that one. So thank you so much. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
If you enjoy the pod, we would love for you to give us a follow and rate us on Apple Podcasts, which helps us get the word out and reach new listeners. Our sources are available on Patreon, where if you choose to become a patron, you'll also get access to bonus content, our monthly book club, and our eternal gratitude.
If you'd like to get in touch or suggest a topic for a future episode, email us at everythingiknowaboutpod@gmail.com or DM us across all socials at EikaPod, that's EIKA pod. Thanks for listening and see you next week.